Today we're going to talk about the coronavirus in light of the Black Plague of the 14th century. Before an understanding of viral outbreaks and epidemiology, people scrambled for explanations during the terrifying plague of the Black Death. The Black Death spread and rapidly decimated the world between 1348 and 1350, a terrible 2-year window that had a 150-year dark shadow. The bubonic plague spread by fleas, as we know now, and after it mutated to a pneumonic plague through viral exhalation from human lungs, the Black Death is the bad boy of ancient plagues. Historians estimate that the plague reduced the world population from its then 475 million to 375 million. 100 million people died. The disease wiped out nearly 30% of the European population. The current coronavirus mortality rate may be as high as 1%, and the population without rapid decisive action to stem its deadly impact would see 1% as a massive and terrible risk, but it pales to the nearly 25% death rate of the 14th century plague, which again required 150 years for the population to rebound and for economies to recover. Now I think, though, we can learn a few things about the impact of that plague and draw some conclusions that I think are actually hopeful regarding what will follow the coronavirus. The 15th century, the 100 years following the plague, really became a bit of a golden age for the survivors. New opportunities, land and jobs opened up, raising wages and the standard of living for many in the world and most of Europe. The value of workers increased exponentially. A sadly positive outcome resulting from the loss of so many able-bodied people to the plague. A number of significant innovations took place as a result of the Black Death. For example, tending crops, which was hugely labor-intensive, decreased as a way of food production, and animal husbandry increased rapidly. It only required shepherd a few dogs and some relatively unmaintained pasture land. Feudal systems in which lords of manors would employ cheap peasants and slave-like serfs who were bound to the lord of the manor, that system collapsed. Now, there were a number of other factors that played a significant role in this entire feudal system shift as well. But the Black Plague was a significant aspect of that, and it led to what essentially became a modern political movement with nations having a strong central government, with an increase in rights for the common person, even if never fully realized. What we have today is a world we recognize came as a result of the Black Death. Here's for an example that shines through this. During and before the plague, only male descendants could inherit land. However, after the plague, women, the daughters of landowners, could also inherit the land to become business owners. There were, of course, terrible conspiracies and things that arose during the Black Death. God receives the lion's share of the blame. People didn't understand the role of germs, for example, and clearly it was the sin of humankind that caused such a drastic and devastating plague to take place. I can't even fathom the horror that people faced as families were forced, for example, to place their dying children or parents or brothers and sisters and cousins out from their home as they were dying onto the street to watch them from the other side of a window as they died because they couldn't afford the infection in their household. Now, the primary European conspiracy, though, that led to some even worse terror was that Jews were responsible, that they had infected wells leading to the Black Death. 350 entire Jewish communities were massacred as a result of this fear, the scapegoating that takes place. That was the Christian world not behaving very Christianly. Islamic world wasn't much better. So they blamed the plague upon the sin of lust, which was caused by women. And so all women were forced to stay in a closet or in their room and not permitted to make any public appearances during the Black Death. Awkwardly enough, that form of shelter in place may have even had ironic positive impact despite its terribly misguided rationale. Of course, we see similar conspiracy theories in our own day, and these are negative and have negative impact. Another negative impact of the plague was the massive death casualty rate of clergy who would care for the sick and would die at a larger rate. This left a massive shortage of clergy, of pastors, of trained and educated people. It led to the collapse of the monastery system, which had boomed, but now, today, is essentially a footnote in religious history because of the Black Death. The lack of trained clergy, however, led to the largest, fastest, and best funded emergence of universities and institutions of higher education that the world had ever seen in an attempt to inspire, train, and deploy a renewed number of educated leaders in churches and communities. It was a terrible event, but it led to a renaissance of education. Clearly, science had not taken a foothold during the plague. It didn't exist as a guide for best practice regarding the treating of the spread of a disease or anything else for that matter, but in the epic wake of this terror, a renewed fascination with the study of human anatomy took place, and no longer were people observing merely a dead body and learning from its anatomy, but now, guided by an interest in biology, they were looking at different states of health of the body and anatomy during different levels of sickness and health. A very significant change was a rise in the status of surgeons and of physicians, which we experience today as a blessing. The cultural impact was tremendous. The arts, the music and dramatic arts all took a dark turn during the Black Death. As you can imagine, during an era in which AMC's The Walking Dead looks tame, that there would be a morbid reflection of death in the arts. However, this led to the most creative and innovative single epoch, at least in the history of Europe, that has ever happened, the Renaissance. With the world turned upside down and a failure of religion to have a clear answer to why these horrors were happening, and a decline in the power of authority allowed for an insurgence of questioning, of experimenting, of re-envisioning the world, of new innovation, and it shook the culture. It was the plague that unleashed the forces that made creativity and the Renaissance possible. Even as today, people are experimenting with all kinds of new things in the coronavirus in order to understand the world and see what's really important. Well, arising from the ashes of a decimated world were the rise of education, human rights, practical innovations requiring less human labor for better commercial outcomes, a renewed flourishing of arts and of the culture. There is no doubt that it was a terrible time, but it did lead to a renewed humanity. The pandemic that we experience today, it is impactful on a far, far lesser scale, and it will not take 150 years to recover economically or the lost population, but we are already seeing significant shifts in culture, technology, the arts, and even how we reframe societal responsibility. To think about care for all citizens, not just those who can afford access to medicine or have the reserves to weather an extended loss of income, but a true concern and care for the larger population around us is emerging from the coronavirus. Further, many of us are now faced with existential thoughts. What is really important in life? And how will I continue to focus on what is truly important in the coming days? Well, the Black Death, the plague of the 14th century, was horrendous, and there is no real comparison with the coronavirus. But there were positive outcomes even then, and there will be positive outcomes even today. Continue to weather the storm. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Embrace the value of science and continue to love one another. This is Superintendent Mark Adams with the Network of Undeniable Blessing, the Free Methodist Churches of Northern California and Nevada, believing you are an undeniable blessing.